The alarms did not ring that morning, and that silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was standing on the observation deck of Threshold Station when it happened, holding a cup of something warm that I never finished. Every screen around me should have been tracking at least 40 human vessels moving through our monitored lanes. Trade convoys, diplomatic shuttles, a science ship or two, always a little late, always apologizing for it. That was the rhythm of things. 300 years of that rhythm had made me forget to expect anything else. Then the screens went empty. Not damaged, not jammed. Empty, the way a room is empty after everyone has quietly packed their bags and walked out while you were sleeping. I remember setting my cup down so fast that it spilled across the console, and nobody around me said a word about the mess. We were all staring at the same thing. Every single human ship registered in council space had vanished within the same 6-hour window. No distress call, no formal notice, no farewell transmission, not even a short one, not even a rude one. Just gone, like a held breath finally released. My first thought was an attack. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty is the only thing I have left to offer at this point in my life. My first thought was that someone had taken them, or destroyed them, and my heart's nearly stopped at the thought of explaining that failure to my own government. But attacks leave wreckage. Attacks leave signals of struggle, however faint. This left nothing. No debris, no emergency beacons, no last recorded transmissions cut short mid-sentence. This was not a disaster. This was a decision. I left the observation deck and walked, alone, to the human embassy on the station. I had walked that corridor 100 times before, always greeted by a young officer named Nathan Price, who had a habit of offering visitors tea before they even asked for it. The doors were unlocked, the lights were on, and when I stepped inside, I understood, for the first time, what it means for a place to be abandoned rather than destroyed. There was a cup of coffee on a desk, still faintly warm, as if someone had simply stood up mid-sip and walked away. A terminal blinked quietly in the corner, still logged into a system, showing a half-finished report about grain shipments to a colony 3 systems away. On one wall, pinned with a small magnet shaped like a star, there was a child's drawing, a stick-figure family, standing beside something that was clearly meant to be a spaceship, with the words, "Home soon," written underneath in careful, uneven handwriting. I stood there longer than I should have. I did not touch anything. It felt somehow like touching a memory that was not mine to hold. They had not fled in fear. Fear leaves things in disorder. Drawers pulled open, doors left swinging, chairs knocked over in a hurry. This was neat. This was intentional. Every non-essential item had been left exactly where it belonged, as if the people who once used them expected to return and simply chose not to. It was, in its own quiet way, the most unsettling thing I had ever witnessed, because it told me that humanity had not panicked. Humanity had planned. By the time I returned to the main council chamber, the emergency session had already been called. I had sat in that chamber for over a century, through trade disputes and border disagreements and the occasional shouting match between delegates who should have known better. I had never seen it like this. Delegates from a dozen worlds sat frozen, staring at empty display feeds where human fleet positions used to update in real time. Someone near the back was quietly repeating the words, "all of them," as if saying it twice might make it less true. The council speaker, an elder from the Threen Assembly named Ellen Marsh in the common tongue we used for translation convenience, called the session to order with a voice that shook slightly despite decades of practiced calm. She asked simply, what had happened? Nobody answered, because nobody knew. I was asked to stand. I had overseen human diplomatic relations for the last 11 years, long enough to be considered the council's foremost expert on a species that, until that morning, most of us had considered predictable, cooperative, and above all, patient. I remember rising to my feet and feeling for the first time in my long career that I had absolutely nothing useful to say. I told the chamber the truth. I told them there had been no warning, no formal communication, no indication in any recent exchange that anything of this scale was being prepared. I told them the embassy had been left in a state of careful order, not chaos, which suggested planning rather than panic. I told them their fleet had not simply left the station, but had left every point of council space simultaneously, as though following a single signal that none of our systems had detected. Someone asked the obvious question: where did they go? I did not have an answer. Sensor sweeps found nothing. Long-range arrays that should have tracked departing vessels for hours after their exit found no trace of drive signatures, no debris, no residual energy readings consistent with any known form of travel. It was as if an entire species had stepped behind a curtain and pulled it shut without disturbing a single thread of air. The speaker turned to me and asked the question I had been dreading since I first saw the empty screens. Why would they leave like this? Not in anger, not in war, in silence. And here is the part I did not say aloud in that chamber, though I should have. I did not say that I already had a suspicion, buried somewhere beneath the shock, of what this silence meant. I did not say that 5 years earlier, I had sat in a very similar chamber and voted for a decision that I privately doubted, and that I had spent every day since telling myself the matter was closed because the council had said so. Before the session ended, the speaker asked if any delegate present had prior direct experience serving on committees related to human affairs during the last decade. I remember the pause that followed, the way several delegates shifted in their seats without meeting each other's eyes, before I finally raised my hand, along with 2 others. One was Paul Grant, still serving after all these years, his expression unreadable. The other was a quieter delegate named John Baxter, who had joined the Health and Security Committee shortly after the crisis, though he had not been present for the original vote. The speaker asked the 3 of us to remain after the session for a private briefing. I remember walking to that smaller chamber with a growing unease in my chest, uncertain whether I was being asked to help solve this mystery or being quietly positioned to answer for it. When we sat down, the speaker asked us plainly whether either event, the quarantine crisis or the sudden departure, might be connected in any way we were aware of. Paul Grant answered first, and with more confidence than I expected, insisting that the matter had been formally closed years ago, that compensation had been offered and accepted, and that any connection between the 2 events would require actual evidence rather than speculation. John Baxter said little, only that he had reviewed the compensation records once, briefly, and found them procedurally sound, though he admitted he had never spoken directly with anyone from the affected colonies himself. When the speaker turned to me, I found myself hesitating in a way that surprised even me. I told her, carefully, that I did not know of any direct connection, which was, in the strictest sense, true. But I also told her that the timing troubled me. 5 years between a crisis we called resolved and a departure we could not explain, and that I believed it deserved careful examination rather than quick dismissal. She studied me for a long moment before nodding and instructing me to lead a formal inquiry with full authority to request records, interviews, and travel clearance wherever the investigation required. I left that smaller chamber feeling the full weight of the responsibility settling onto my shoulders, heavier than anything I had carried in my long career. I understood even then that this investigation would not simply uncover facts about humanity's departure. It would eventually require me to examine my own silence during that original vote, and I was not yet certain I was prepared for what that examination might reveal about myself. I was assigned to lead the investigation. It felt less like an honor and more like being handed a mirror I had spent 5 years trying not to look into. As I left the chamber that day, I passed by a young aide carrying a data pad, and on its screen, just for a moment, I saw a final transmission log from the human embassy, time-stamped 6 hours before their departure. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was a single line, addressed to no one in particular, as though left for whoever might eventually come looking. It read simply, "We finished waiting." Before I left the chamber, a young clerk named Grace Miller stopped me in the corridor, holding a stack of printed reports against her chest, like they might slip away from her if she loosened her grip. She asked me, in a voice far too steady for someone her age, whether I thought the humans were coming back. I remember looking at her and realizing I did not know how to answer honestly without frightening her, so I told her I did not know, which was, at least, the truth. She told me something then that I have never forgotten. She said her older brother had served on a joint engineering team with several human technicians 2 years earlier, helping maintain a shared communications relay near the edge of council space. She said her brother had once mentioned, almost in passing, that the human technicians had stopped asking questions about long-term maintenance schedules. At the time, he had assumed it meant nothing at all, simply a shift in workload, perhaps a change in staffing on their end. Now, standing in that corridor with the entire fleet gone, she wondered if it had meant something else entirely. I asked her where her brother was stationed now. She told me he had been reassigned 3 months earlier, quietly, without much explanation, to a different relay entirely, one that no longer had any human presence on it at all. I thanked her for the information and continued walking, though I found myself replaying her words for the rest of that day, turning them over like a stone I could not quite identify the shape of. I spent that first night unable to sleep, sitting alone in my quarters with every screen in my apartment dark except for one, replaying the final recorded departure feed over and over, though there was almost nothing to see, a steady field of stars. A single moment where the sensor grid registered movement across dozens of separate locations simultaneously, then nothing, as though someone had drawn a curtain closed across an entire section of the galaxy in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I kept thinking about the coffee cup left on that desk, still warm when I found it. I kept wondering how long it had actually been sitting there before I arrived, and whether whoever had been drinking it had known, in that exact moment, that they would never sit at that desk again. I wondered if they had felt anything at all walking away from a life they had built carefully over years, or if the decision had simply become, by then, as ordinary and unremarkable as locking a door behind them for the last time. I did not understand it then. I understood it far too well by the time this was over. 5 years earlier, there had been a vote. I remember the chamber that day with a clarity that has never faded, though I have tried, more than once, to let it. It was not a session that drew much attention at the time. There was no fanfare, no urgent gathering of delegates from every corner of council space. It was, by all outward appearances, a routine matter of policy during a health crisis, the kind of vote that gets recorded, filed, and forgotten within a season. A plague had broken out among the outer human colonies, 11 settlements strung along the far edge of their expanding territory, places with names I had to relearn because I had never bothered to memorize them properly before that. The Council's medical division, relying on incomplete and, as we later learned, badly flawed data, classified the outbreak as a potential vector risk to nearby non-human populations. The word vector stuck with me. It turned frightened, suffering people into a category, a designation, a line item in a containment protocol. I sat on the Health and Security Committee that year, one voice among 11, and I remember the debate lasting less than 2 hours. 2 hours to decide the fate of 11 human colonies. I remember a delegate from the Threen Assembly, a careful and by all accounts reasonable man named Paul Grant in the common tongue, arguing that immediate quarantine was the only responsible action, given the uncertainty of the data. I remember another delegate, quieter, from a smaller member world, raising a hesitant objection, asking whether we had verified the data at all before acting on it. I remember staying silent. I want to be honest about why. It was not because I believed the quarantine was right. Even then, something in my chest resisted the decision, some instinct that told me we were treating a medical uncertainty as a settled fact, because settling it quickly was easier than investigating it properly. But I valued consensus. I valued my own comfortable place within it. And so when the vote came, I raised my hand in favor, along with the majority, and told myself that the medical division surely knew more than I did. The quarantine was implemented within days. Transit corridors to and from the 11 colonies were sealed. Relief ships carrying medicine and supplies from other human systems were denied clearance, held in holding patterns just outside the quarantine boundary, waiting for a review process that moved with the unhurried pace of bureaucracy, while people on the ground ran out of everything that kept them alive. I did not visit those colonies during the crisis. I want to say that if I had, I would have acted differently, but I am no longer certain that is true, and I think pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. I only saw the numbers afterward, in the quiet, procedural report that followed the crisis's resolution. 73,000 names. That was the final count, compiled in a document that used careful, clinical language to describe what had, in plain terms, been a slow and preventable loss of life behind a barrier we ourselves had built and refused to lower in time. 18 months later, the council issued a formal apology. I remember it being praised, at the time, for its thoroughness. It acknowledged the flawed data. It acknowledged the delay in relief efforts. It offered compensation, framed in careful legal terms, to the surviving colonies and their government. It was, by every procedural standard we use to measure such things, sufficient. The matter was formally closed. A line was drawn beneath it in the record, and the council moved on to other business, other votes, other quiet mornings. Humanity, notably, never said the matter was closed. They did not respond with anger, not publicly. They did not withdraw their ambassadors or cancel their trade agreements or raise their voices in the chamber. They continued attending council sessions with the same quiet professionalism they always had. Their delegates still greeted us politely in the halls. Their traders still honored their contracts to the letter. From the outside, it looked exactly like forgiveness, and I think most of us, myself included, mistook it for exactly that. In the months immediately following the crisis, before the apology was even drafted, I remember attending a smaller, less formal gathering of delegates who had voted alongside me. It was not an official session, simply a quiet dinner meant to ease the tension that had settled over the committee since the numbers began coming in. I remember Paul Grant raising a glass that evening, suggesting we had all made the best decision available to us given the information we had at the time, and that no reasonable body could have been expected to do differently under such uncertainty. I remember raising my glass along with everyone else at that table, and I remember the relief I felt in doing so, the comfort of being told, by someone confident and respected, that the weight I was quietly carrying was not truly mine to carry at all. I did not know, that evening, that a human trade attaché had been seated at a nearby table, close enough, I later learned, to hear at least part of that conversation. I did not know until much later that the story of that toast, softened and distorted through retelling, had eventually made its way back to colony survivors, who understood it, correctly, as evidence that the people responsible for the decision considered the matter settled long before any survivor had been given the chance to say otherwise. I visited the memorial wall once, nearly a year after the apology was issued. It had been built on one of the surviving colonies, a long, dark surface engraved with 73,000 names, far too many to read in a single visit. I remember standing before it in silence, feeling a discomfort I could not quite name at the time, and then leaving, and never returning. I told myself I was busy. I told myself there would be time later. There was always time later, until quite suddenly there was not. What I did not understand then, what none of us in the council seemed to understand, was that humanity had not simply forgiven us and moved forward. They had simply stopped expecting an apology to mean anything more than words on a page, and they had quietly begun deciding what they would do instead of waiting for us to become the kind of partners who would not need to apologize again. I did not know, in the years that followed, that human engineers had begun redesigning their drive systems using research kept entirely off council-registered networks. I did not know that human diplomatic staff had spent those years slowly reducing every point of technical dependency between their infrastructure and ours, replacing shared systems with their own, one careful upgrade at a time, always announced as routine maintenance. I did not know that trade routes patrolled quietly by human vessels, routes the rest of us had simply assumed would always be safe, because humans had always kept them safe, were being mapped and handed over to automated systems, freeing up their ships for something else entirely. I did not know, because I did not ask. None of us asked. We assumed that a species capable of such patience, such steady and composed forgiveness, simply had nothing left to plan. We mistook their silence for acceptance, when it was in fact the sound of a decision being made one careful year at a time, far below the surface of anything we thought to monitor. Looking back now, I think the vote itself was not the moment that broke something. It was the 18 months of quiet, orderly diplomacy that followed, the letters exchanged, the trade agreements honored, the polite greetings in the hallway, all of it perfectly correct, all of it hiding a decision that had already been made and was simply being carried out with the same careful precision humanity brought to everything else. I think, if I am honest, that the moment I should have understood everything was not the vote itself, and not even the memorial wall. It was a small detail I noticed and dismissed at the time, A single line in a routine trade report about a shipment of construction materials heading toward the outer edge of human space. Materials that did not match any project registered with the Council's Oversight Office. I remember reading it, shrugging, and moving on to the next document on my desk. There was another detail from that period I did not think about again until much later, though I should have. A few months after the apology was issued, a human trade representative named Peter Hall requested a private meeting with several members of the Health and Security Committee. I attended that meeting, along with 3 other delegates, expecting the usual careful discussion about compensation logistics and future safety protocols. Instead, Peter Hall asked us a single question, and then said very little else for the rest of the meeting. He asked us what would happen if the same situation occurred again, with a different set of colonies, under a different set of circumstances, but with the same uncertainty in the data. He asked whether the Council had changed anything about how such decisions were made, or whether the same committee, with the same 2-hour deliberation window, would simply reach the same conclusion under similar pressure. Nobody in that room had a good answer. I remember Paul Grant, the delegate who had argued so firmly for the original quarantine, assuring Peter Hall that safeguards were being reviewed, that lessons had been learned, that such an outcome would not be allowed to repeat itself. Peter Hall thanked him politely, made a brief note on the datapad in front of him, and left without further comment. I did not think much of that meeting at the time. I filed it away, the way I filed away so many small and uncomfortable moments during those years, as simply another part of the process of moving forward. I understand now that it was not a courtesy visit at all. It was data collection. Humanity was not asking us to reassure them. They were testing whether we could offer anything beyond reassurance, and quietly recording the answer for a decision they had likely already begun making long before Peter Hall ever sat down at that table. I also remember, though I did not connect it to anything at the time, a gradual and almost invisible shift in the tone of human communications over those 5 years. Reports that once included detailed requests for joint research opportunities became shorter, more procedural, focused only on the specific matter at hand. Invitations to informal cultural exchanges, the kind that once filled our shared calendars with concerts and festivals and small delegations visiting one another's worlds simply for the pleasure of it, slowly stopped arriving. Official cooperation continued exactly as required. Everything beyond that, everything built on warmth rather than obligation, quietly faded, one small cancellation at a time, until none of us noticed it was gone, until it had already been gone for years. I think, if I had been paying closer attention, I might have recognized the shape of what was happening long before that final morning. But attention requires effort, and effort requires believing that something might actually be wrong, and for 5 comfortable years, believing that was simply easier not to do. There was one more encounter from that period I have thought about often since, one I did not fully understand until much later. Roughly 2 years after the crisis, I attended a small reception marking the anniversary of humanity's original entry into Provisional Council membership, an event that had once been celebrated with genuine warmth and had, by then, become something closer to routine formality. A human representative named Karen West approached me during that reception, holding a drink she never seemed to actually drink from, and asked me a question I dismissed too quickly at the time. She asked whether I believed the Council was capable of changing its own procedures without an external crisis forcing its hand. I remember answering carefully, diplomatically, saying that institutions evolve slowly but surely, that patience was simply part of governing so many different worlds with so many different needs. She listened to my answer politely, nodded once, and then asked a second question that I did not think much of until years later. She asked whether patience, in my experience, had ever actually produced change on its own, or whether it had only ever produced more patience. I laughed, lightly, assuming she was simply making conversation, and told her that was a fair point worth considering. She smiled back at me, thanked me for my honesty, and excused herself shortly afterward. I did not see her again after that evening, though I later learned, from the archive itself, that Karen West had gone on to help lead the very policy team responsible for designing humanity's long-term independence strategy, beginning less than a year after that quiet, unremarkable conversation at a reception nobody else seemed to remember at all. It would be 5 more years before I understood exactly what those materials were for, and by then there was nothing left to stop, only a silence to explain. When the Council granted me clearance to travel to human space, it was not because of diplomatic pressure or careful negotiation. It was because humanity itself requested that a witness be sent, and my name, apparently, was the one they asked for by name. I remember reading that detail in my travel orders and feeling something cold settle in my chest, because being asked for by name after 5 years of silence did not feel like an honor. It felt like being summoned to answer for something. The journey took longer than it should have, mostly because so few of our ships still had accurate charts of the region. Human space had changed since I last visited, and not in small ways. Orbital stations that once bristled with Council-compatible docking systems had been stripped and rebuilt entirely. I remember our pilot, a careful young officer, muttering under his breath as our navigation system struggled to recognize half the beacons we passed, because they were broadcasting in protocols none of our ships had ever seen. When we finally reached Earth's orbital ring, I asked to see the fleet. What I found waiting for us was not an armed blockade or a hostile welcome. It was something, in its own way, far more unsettling. Rows of vessels, sleek and unfamiliar, moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded me of clockwork rather than any drive system I recognized. Their hulls carried no Council registration markings at all, not out of hostility, but because they simply no longer needed them. I asked our escort what propulsion system the ships were using, and she smiled politely and told me that was not information she was authorized to share. Before I met Alice Dunn again, I was first greeted at the docking gate by a young officer named Henry Cross, who introduced himself with a polite handshake and none of the warmth I remembered from human greetings in years past. He informed me, in careful and measured tones, that I would be permitted access to designated public areas of the orbital ring, that certain restricted zones remained off-limits regardless of my Council credentials, and that any request outside these boundaries would need to be submitted through proper channels for review. I remember being struck by how procedural his manner was, how closely it mirrored the very language the Council itself so often used when explaining why something reasonable could not be permitted just yet. I asked him, half in jest, whether he had trained specifically for diplomatic assignments involving Council visitors. He answered, without any trace of humor, that all personnel interacting with outside delegations now received the same standardized briefing, regardless of rank or department, and that consistency in tone was considered a priority going forward. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more pointed things anyone said to me during that entire visit, delivered so plainly that it took me several minutes to fully understand exactly how deliberate it had been. Her name was Alice Dunn, and she had once served as a translator during the early years of humanity's provisional membership. I remembered her from official functions, always polite, always careful with her words, the kind of person who chose every sentence like she was setting a table for guests she respected deeply. She still had that same care in her voice now, but there was a distance in it that had not existed before. A courtesy that felt, somehow, colder than open anger would have. She led me through the orbital ring personally, and I found myself grateful for her presence, if only because everyone else we passed regarded me with the same polite, unreadable expression, as though I were a guest at a funeral for someone they had once loved deeply and had already finished grieving. We passed a construction yard unlike anything I had seen in Council space. A vast lattice of half-built structures stretching outward from a modest star, clearly the early framework of a solar collection array on a scale that would take most Council worlds a century to even propose, let alone build. I asked Alice what it was for, and she told me, simply, that it was for energy independence, a project that had been underway for years, quietly funded and quietly built while humanity continued attending Council sessions as though nothing at all had changed. I asked her, finally, the question I had traveled so far to ask. I asked her why. Why leave without a word? Why disappear so completely? After everything, after years of continued cooperation, after every appearance of moving forward together. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was calm in a way that unsettled me more than shouting ever could have. She told me that humanity had never stopped moving forward with the Council, not once, not even during the quarantine, not even in the months after the memorial wall was built. What they had stopped doing, she said, was assuming that moving forward together meant the council would ever truly change how it made decisions when human lives were the ones at risk. She told me about the internal review humanity had conducted after the crisis, not the council's review, but their own, quiet and thorough, examining exactly how a decision affecting 11 colonies had been made in under 2 hours by a committee that never once directly consulted the people it would affect. She told me they had studied every similar decision the council had made in the centuries before, and found a pattern so consistent it could hardly be called a coincidence anymore. Caution toward outsiders, speed toward consensus, very little space in either case for the individual lives caught in between. She told me this was not a story of anger, though I think she could see in my expression that I expected one. It was a story of arithmetic. Humanity had simply finished calculating what the council's approach to caution would cost them in any future crisis, and had decided, quietly and deliberately, that the answer was too high a price to keep paying in exchange for a seat at a table where their voice was heard, politely, and then overruled. I asked her why they had not simply told us this. Why leave without explanation, without warning, without so much as a formal notice of withdrawal? She looked at me then with something that was not quite pity and not quite disappointment, but held pieces of both. She reminded me that humanity had explained things before. They had explained, calmly and repeatedly, in the months following the crisis, why the response had cost lives that should never have been lost. They had explained it in formal proceedings, in written reports, in careful diplomatic language chosen specifically so that no one could claim to have misunderstood. The council had listened, issued its apology, and closed the file. She said that humanity had learned, slowly and painfully, that explanations only mattered to people willing to be changed by them. And so, this time, there had been no explanation offered in advance, because an explanation offered in advance is, in its own way, a request for permission to leave, and humanity had decided they no longer needed anyone's permission to protect themselves. I asked her if this was truly final, if there was truly nothing that could bring them back to the table as full and equal partners in council affairs. She did not answer that question directly. Instead, she told me something I have not been able to forget since. She said that humanity had not left out of hatred, and that this, more than anything, was the detail I should carry back with me. They had left because they still, in some quiet and complicated way, cared enough about the outcome to remove themselves from a system that had already shown them, in the clearest terms possible, exactly how much their lives were worth when weighed against convenience. On my second day, I was given permission to observe a routine training exercise involving several of the new automated defense platforms, conducted at a safe distance from the orbital ring. I stood beside Alice Dunn on an observation platform as a series of drone vessels moved through coordinated maneuvers with a precision that unsettled me more than any display of raw power could have. I asked her how long these platforms had been in active development, and she told me, without hesitation, that early prototypes dated back nearly 4 years, not long after the apology had been issued and the matter formally closed on the council's side of the ledger. I asked her whether the timing was intentional, whether the development of these systems had truly begun so soon after a crisis that, on the surface, appeared to have been resolved peacefully. She turned to look at me directly for the first time since I had arrived, and told me that very little humanity had built over the last 5 years had happened by accident. She said that grief, when it is taken seriously rather than simply processed through official channels, tends to produce very careful people, and that the engineers who designed those very platforms had, in more than one case, lost family members during the quarantine itself. I did not have a response to that. I simply watched the drones complete their final maneuver, forming a precise defensive formation around an empty section of space, a formation designed, I understood now, not for any specific external threat, but for a threat far more abstract and far more difficult to defend against, the threat of once again depending on someone else's timeline to decide whether help would arrive soon enough to matter. On my third day, I asked to see the memorial that humanity had built for the colonies lost during the quarantine, curious whether it resembled the one I had visited briefly, years earlier, on the surviving colony itself. Alice Dunn told me this memorial was different, built more recently, and located not on any colony world but here, in orbit, visible from nearly every approach vector into the system. She said it had been placed there deliberately, so that no ship arriving from Council space could dock without passing near it first. I asked to see it, and she agreed, though I noticed a new stillness in her manner as we approached the observation window facing its direction. The structure itself was modest, a slow, rotating ring inscribed with names, lit softly from within, drifting in quiet orbit like a held breath, given permanent shape. I did not ask to read every name. I do not think I could have managed it, not after everything else I had already seen that week. I simply stood beside her in silence, watching it turn, understanding for the first time exactly how visible this memory had been made, and how deliberately every Council visitor since its construction had been made to see it before setting foot on anything humanity still called their own. I spent 3 more days on that station, mostly in quiet observation, occasionally in short and carefully polite conversations with officials who answered my questions honestly, but without warmth. I saw enough to understand the scale of what had been built during those 5 years of silence. Independent energy systems, new propulsion technology developed entirely outside our shared research agreements, automated defense networks along their new territorial borders that no longer relied on Council coordination at all. None of it, I want to be clear, was built with hostility toward the Council in mind. It was built the way a person builds a shelter after learning, the hard way, that the roof they trusted was never as sound as they believed. Every system I saw was designed for one purpose only, and that purpose was simple. Never again would humanity's survival depend on a vote they had no real voice in. On my final day there, I asked Alice one last question before boarding the ship home. I asked her if humanity still considered the Council an ally. She thought about it for a long moment, longer than any of her previous answers had taken her, and then she told me that humanity still considered the Council a neighbor, and that neighbors could remain courteous, even helpful, even friendly, without ever again mistaking courtesy for trust. I carried that sentence with me the entire journey back, turning it over in my mind more times than I can count, because I understood, somewhere in that long silence between the stars, that it was not an insult. It was simply the truth, delivered with the same calm precision humanity had shown in everything else they had done since that quiet vote 5 years ago, and I did not know, yet, how much heavier that truth would become once I brought it home. Before boarding my ship for the return journey, I asked Alice Dunn if I could see one more place, somewhere ordinary rather than official, somewhere that might show me what daily life actually looked like now, away from construction yards and orbital rings. She hesitated for a moment before agreeing, and I understood, from that small hesitation, that she was choosing to trust me with something rather than simply following procedure. She took me down to the surface, to a small coastal town I will not name here, out of respect for the quiet, ordinary lives of the people living in it. We walked along a street lined with shops and modest homes, and I remember being struck by how unremarkable everything looked. Children ran past us chasing a ball. An older man sat outside a small shop repairing what looked like a simple mechanical bicycle. Nothing about the scene suggested a species preparing to sever itself from an entire interstellar community. It simply looked like life continuing, quietly, the way it always had. I asked Alice how much of the town's population understood what had happened, what their government had built, what their fleet had done that morning when it vanished from every Council sensor at once. She told me most people understood the broad outline of it, though few knew the technical details. She said there had been no attempt to hide the decision from the public, no dramatic announcement either. It had simply been discussed, openly and repeatedly, in public forums over several years, until it stopped feeling like a controversial idea and started feeling like common sense. I found that detail more unsettling than almost anything else I witnessed during my visit. A quarantine decision that cost 73,000 lives had been made by a small committee in under 2 hours. The decision to leave the Council entirely, by contrast, had apparently been discussed openly, patiently, and democratically for years, weighed carefully by an entire population before it was ever carried out. The contrast between those two processes told me more about the actual difference between our two peoples than anything else I encountered during that entire visit. Near the end of our walk, An older woman recognized Alice and stopped to greet her warmly, glancing at me only briefly, before continuing her conversation in a local dialect I did not fully understand. Alice later told me the woman had simply asked whether I was one of the council visitors, and upon learning that I was, had commented that she hoped I would enjoy my visit, and that she hoped too that whatever I reported back home would be honest. I told Alice, as we walked back toward the transport that would return me to orbit, that I intended to be exactly that. She looked at me for a long moment, and though her expression remained carefully composed, I thought I saw, just briefly, something softer beneath it, something almost like the friendship we had once shared before all of this began. She told me she hoped so too, and that she hoped, more than anything, that honesty might eventually mean something more to the council than it had before. I carried that hope with me the entire journey home, uncertain whether I had any right to hold on to it, but unwilling, even so, to let it go entirely. I returned to council space carrying more than a report. I carried a data archive that humanity had given me freely, without conditions, without demands, almost as if they wanted us to understand fully rather than simply be warned. I remember holding that archive during the journey home and feeling the weight of it long before I understood everything it contained. When I presented it to the full council, I watched, piece by piece, as the calm certainty in that chamber began to unravel. The first section of the archive was simple enough, an accounting of infrastructure. It listed every system across council space that had, at some point over the last century, been designed, installed, or maintained with human assistance. I remember the numbers scrolling across the display, and I remember the audible discomfort spreading through the chamber as delegates began to recognize names of stations, trade hubs, and communication relays they depended on daily. Human engineers had built the deep space relay network connecting 3 major trade regions, a system so reliable that most delegates had simply stopped thinking about how it functioned at all. Human maintenance crews had serviced the automated shipping lanes along our busiest corridors for decades, quietly and efficiently, at rates far lower than any other member species had ever offered. Human trade contracts, we learned, had been underwriting nearly a third of all interspecies commerce moving through neutral space, often through partnerships so deeply embedded in daily operations that removing them would require rebuilding entire systems from scratch. A delegate representing one of the larger core worlds, a woman named Susan Vale who had rarely spoken during previous sessions on this matter, rose partway through the presentation and asked whether the archive could be independently verified, or whether the council was simply expected to accept humanity's own accounting at face value. It was a fair question, and I told her so honestly, before explaining that every figure in the archive had already been cross-referenced against our own internal shipping and maintenance records over the preceding week, and that in every case I had checked personally, the numbers matched precisely, often down to figures the council's own records had recorded with far less detail than humanity's version of the same events. Susan Vale sat back down without further comment, though I noticed she did not look away from the display again for the remainder of the session, her earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to quiet alarm as the figures continued to accumulate. I watched Ellen Marsh, the speaker who had called that first emergency session with a trembling voice, read through the figures with an expression I had never seen on her before. It was not anger, it was the particular stillness of someone realizing, all at once, exactly how much weight had been resting on a foundation they never once bothered to inspect. The second section of the archive detailed something far more specific and far more uncomfortable. It listed every piracy incident along the outer trade corridors over the last 2 decades, corridors that connected several smaller member worlds to the larger council trade network. For years, those corridors had remained remarkably safe, a fact that had been quietly credited, in official council reports, to improved automated defense systems and careful regional cooperation. The archive told a different story. Human vessels, operating under contracts most delegates had never bothered to read closely, had been directly responsible for patrolling those corridors, intercepting threats long before they ever reached council-monitored space. The reports were detailed, precise, and utterly without embellishment, listing dates, incidents, and outcomes with the same careful thoroughness humanity brought to everything they did. Over the past 5 years, That patrol coverage had been quietly reduced by more than half, redirected instead toward automated systems still in early stages of deployment, systems that were, by the archive's own admission, not yet fully reliable. A delegate near the front of the chamber, a man from a smaller trade world named John Baxter, in the common tongue, rose to his feet and asked, in a voice tight with barely controlled alarm, what this meant for the safety of those corridors going forward. I did not have a comforting answer for him, because the archive did not offer one either. It simply stated, in the same measured tone as everything else, that those corridors would require increased council investment in the coming years, an investment that had, until now, been quietly absorbed by a partner none of us had thought to properly thank. The third section was, in some ways, the most difficult to sit through, because it was not about infrastructure or trade routes at all. It was a simple list of technologies, developed jointly between human researchers and council institutions over the decades, technologies that were now, as of the archive's final page, formally licensed exclusively for human use going forward. Medical treatments developed using data shared freely by council medical researchers. Environmental systems designed to stabilize fragile colony worlds, several of which belonged to smaller member species who could not easily replace them. None of it, the archive noted, was being withdrawn out of malice. All existing agreements would be honored to their original terms, but no new agreements of that kind would be offered, and no exceptions would be made. I remember the chamber falling into a long, heavy silence after that section finished displaying, a silence broken finally by a young delegate from a newer member world, someone barely old enough to remember the crisis that had started all of this. She asked, quietly, whether this meant the council was being punished. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I did not believe punishment was the right word for what had happened. Punishment implies an act designed specifically to cause harm in return for harm received. What I had witnessed in human space was not built with the council in mind at all, not really. It was built for humanity's own protection, for their own sense of security, and if the council found itself worse off for having lost their quiet, constant support, that was simply the natural result of taking something valuable for granted for far too long, rather than any deliberate attempt to cause us pain. I watched several delegates begin to argue, almost immediately, for a formal council response, framing humanity's departure as an act requiring diplomatic pressure, perhaps even the beginnings of sanctions, as though we could somehow negotiate our way back into a trust we ourselves had spent so carelessly. I stood again, and I asked the chamber to consider something carefully before proceeding any further down that path. I asked them to consider that we were not, in fact, the injured party in this situation. I reminded them, as gently as I could manage, of the 73,000 names on a wall most of us had never visited even once. I reminded them that we had filed an apology, called the matter closed, and moved on with our lives, while humanity quietly absorbed the cost of a decision we made in under 2 hours without ever truly consulting them. I told the chamber that we were not owed an explanation for a wound we had inflicted ourselves, and then filed away as resolved simply because the paperwork said so. The chamber did not fully agree with me that day. Some delegates still argued for pressure, for demands, for some formal acknowledgement from humanity that their departure had consequences the council would not simply accept in silence. But I noticed, as the session continued, that fewer voices rose in support of that position with each passing hour, as the full weight of the archive settled over the room. By the time the session adjourned, no formal action had been decided, but I remember walking out of that chamber with a clarity I had not carried in 5 years, a clarity that felt, in its own strange way, like relief. For the first time since that quiet vote so many years ago, the council was finally looking directly at what it had done, rather than looking past it toward whatever came next. I did not know, walking out of that chamber, whether this clarity would be enough to change anything meaningful going forward. But I understood, finally, that whatever came next could not be built on the same quiet, comfortable silence that had brought us to this point in the first place. In the weeks that followed, I was asked to appear before several smaller committees, each hoping to understand some narrower piece of what the full archive had revealed. I remember one meeting in particular, with a group of delegates representing the smaller trade worlds most dependent on those now thinly patrolled outer corridors. Their questions were practical, almost desperate in their specificity. How quickly could automated systems be improved? What would it cost to fund additional patrols using our own resources? Whether any private human contractors might still be willing to continue their work under new, independently negotiated agreements, separate from official council channels. I did not have confident answers for most of their questions, and I told them so honestly, though I could see how little comfort that honesty provided. One delegate, a quiet representative named Kate Lawson from a small agricultural colony near the edge of that same corridor system, asked me directly whether her world's supply routes were now less safe than they had been a year earlier. I told her, as gently as I could, that based on the archive's own figures, that was very likely true, at least for the time being, until new systems could be fully developed and tested. She did not react with anger. She simply nodded, thanked me for my honesty, and asked whether I thought the council would move quickly enough to address the gap before something serious happened. I told her I did not know, and that this uncertainty was, in many ways, exactly the kind of uncertainty humanity had grown tired of living inside of. I also spent considerable time during those weeks reviewing older records, searching for any earlier indication we might have missed, any warning buried in a routine report that we had simply failed to recognize for what it was. I found several, scattered across years of otherwise unremarkable communications, a gradual reduction in joint research proposals, a quiet increase in fully independent human-owned infrastructure projects, a subtle shift, barely noticeable at the time, in how human representatives phrased their long-term commitments, always careful now to specify exact terms and exact durations, rather than the open-ended language of partnership that had once characterized nearly everything they proposed. None of these details, taken alone, would have alarmed anyone. Taken together, laid end to end across 5 years, they formed a picture so clear it became difficult to understand how none of us had noticed it forming in real time. I think this, more than anything else I uncovered during that period, troubled me most deeply. Not that humanity had planned so carefully, but that we had been given every opportunity to notice, and had simply chosen, again and again, not to look closely enough to see it. The final council session on this matter was called nearly 2 months after I returned from human space, long enough for the initial shock to settle into something quieter and more difficult to sit with. I stood before the full assembly one last time to deliver my closing report, and I remember choosing my words carefully, because I understood, by then, that this was not simply a matter of describing what had happened, it was a matter of finally telling the truth about what it meant. I told the chamber that humanity was not gone. They had not vanished from existence, had not turned hostile, had not become some distant threat lurking at the edges of council space, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They were simply no longer waiting for us. They had built, quietly and deliberately, a future that did not depend on our permission, our approval, or our slow and careful processes ever managing to become something better than they had been 5 years earlier. Before the vote was called, a young delegate I had not spoken with before, a representative from one of the newer member worlds named Daniel Cole, asked to address the chamber. I remember him being nervous, his voice catching slightly as he began, clearly aware that he was speaking to delegates who had served for decades longer than he had. He said he had spent the last several weeks studying the full archive humanity had given us, not simply the summaries prepared for the council session, but every detail within it, including sections most delegates had likely skimmed past without much thought. He told the chamber that one particular section had stayed with him more than any other. It was a short internal memo, buried deep within the archive, written by a human policy analyst several years earlier, during the early planning stages of what would eventually become their departure. The memo was brief, almost clinical in tone, but Daniel Cole read a portion of it aloud, paraphrasing carefully rather than quoting directly, and I remember the chamber falling completely silent as he spoke. He said the memo described the council not as an enemy, and not even as an unreliable partner, but as an institution that had simply never been forced to feel the weight of its own decisions the way the people affected by them did. It suggested that the only way to change that dynamic permanently was not through further complaint or further negotiation, both of which had already been tried and had produced only careful apologies and closed files, but through the quiet removal of everything the council had come to depend on, without ever noticing the dependency at all. Daniel Cole told the chamber that reading that memo had changed how he understood the entire situation. It was not written with cruelty. It was written with a kind of patient, almost mournful clarity, the words of people who had hoped for a different outcome and had simply run out of reasons to keep hoping for it through the usual channels. He said he intended to vote in favor of sending the delegation, not because he believed it would fix anything quickly, but because he believed the council owed humanity the effort of trying, even now, even this late, even knowing it might change very little in the end. A vote was called that day, to send a formal delegation to Earth, an attempt to reopen a relationship that had, in every practical sense, already closed on its own terms. I voted in favor of it, because I believed, and still believe, that reaching out is always better than allowing silence to become permanent through simple neglect. But I remember standing in that chamber afterward with a quiet certainty settled deep in my chest, a certainty I did not share aloud that day, though perhaps I should have. I was certain that delegation would be received. I was certain it would be treated with warmth, with courtesy, with the same careful hospitality humanity had always shown, even in the months following the crisis that started all of this. I was certain, too, that it would change absolutely nothing about the distance that now existed between us, because humanity had already shown us, with perfect clarity, that courtesy and trust are not the same thing, and that one does not automatically lead back to the other simply because enough time has passed. I think, if I am honest, that this is the lesson I have carried most heavily since that morning the alarms did not ring. For most of my long career, I believed the Council's greatest strength was its patience, its careful procedure, its ability to absorb any single mistake through slow and deliberate process, given enough time and enough paperwork. I believed that as long as we eventually acknowledged our errors, however slowly, however imperfectly, the relationships we had built would simply endure, the way a bridge endures despite the occasional storm. Watching humanity's ships disappear taught me something I had never fully understood before that morning. Some mistakes do not require endless debate to become final. They do not require a formal declaration, a dramatic confrontation, or even so much as a raised voice. They simply require the people who lived through them to finish deciding, quietly and completely, what they are willing to accept going forward, and to act accordingly, without asking anyone else's permission to do so. I think of Alice Dunn often, and the way she spoke to me during my visit, with a courtesy so complete it felt, at times, more distant than anger ever could have. I think of the child's drawing pinned to the wall of that abandoned embassy, the careful handwriting beneath it, "Home soon," a promise that, as far as I know, was never actually broken, because humanity never said they were leaving council space forever. They simply stopped needing to be present in it the way they once were, stopped needing our approval for their own survival, stopped waiting patiently at a table where their voice had so often been heard, and then quietly overruled. The formal delegation was eventually sent, several months after that final session, led by Ellen Marsh herself, along with a small group of carefully chosen representatives, including Daniel Cole, whose words in that chamber had, in their own quiet way, helped shape the decision to go at all. I did not travel with them, though I followed their reports closely from council space, reading each one with a kind of cautious hope I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. The reports confirmed exactly what I expected. The delegation was received warmly, housed comfortably, given every courtesy a visiting party could reasonably hope for. They were shown, openly and without hesitation, portions of the new infrastructure humanity had built, the independent energy systems, the redesigned defense networks, all of it presented plainly, without pride and without apology, simply as fact. They were told, clearly and without hostility, that humanity remained willing to trade, to communicate, to cooperate on matters of mutual benefit, exactly as Alice Dunn had told me months earlier. They were also told, just as clearly, that humanity had no intention of returning to full council membership in the way it had once existed, and no intention of allowing any single external body to hold that kind of authority over their survival again. Ellen Marsh's final report described the meetings as productive, respectful, and in her own words, quietly final in a way that no amount of continued diplomacy seemed likely to change. I read that report late one evening, alone in my quarters, the same quarters where I had once sat awake, replaying an empty departure feed over and over, searching for something in the silence that simply was not there to find. I remember setting the report down and sitting for a long while in the stillness that followed, thinking not about what had been lost, though there was certainly loss in it, but about what had been learned, and whether learning it now, this late, could still be considered worth something. I think it can. I think it must be, because the alternative, believing that a lesson learned late is a lesson not worth learning at all, would mean giving up on the possibility of becoming better entirely, and I am not yet willing to accept that, whatever else this experience has cost us. I still serve on the council today, though my role has changed considerably since that first emergency session so many years ago. I have spent much of my remaining career arguing, in every session where the subject arises, that we owe humanity more than careful language and formal apologies filed away and forgotten. I do not know if that argument has truly taken root in the Council's culture, or if it remains, even now, a minority position held by an aging ambassador who once sat silently through a vote he privately doubted, and has spent every year since trying to make up for that silence in whatever small ways remain available to him. A few weeks after the delegation returned, I received an unexpected private message, routed through several layers of official channels before finally reaching my personal terminal. It was from Alice Dunn, brief and carefully worded, though warmer in tone than anything she had said to me during my visit. She wrote that she had read my original report to the Council, the one submitted immediately after my return from Sol System, and that she wanted me to know it had been shared, quietly, among several of the people who had helped design humanity's departure in the first place. She wrote that they had found it accurate, which she said mattered more to them than I likely understood. She explained that humanity had spent so many years being described in council records using careful, distancing language, terms like affected population or impacted parties, language that made it easier to discuss loss without truly sitting with it. She said my report had not done that. It had used names, it had described a coffee cup left warm on a desk, and a child's drawing pinned to a wall, and 73,000 names on a memorial most delegates had never bothered to visit even once. She told me that small detail, more than any policy change we might eventually make, was the first sign she had seen in years that someone within the council was finally willing to look directly at what had happened, rather than past it. She closed her message simply, saying she hoped it would not be the last such report the council chose to write, and that she remained, despite everything, glad to have once called me a friend. I read that message more times than I am willing to admit, and I have kept it saved in a private file ever since, not because it resolved anything, but because it reminded me that honesty, however late it arrives, is still capable of reaching someone, even across a distance as vast and deliberate as the one humanity had chosen to place between us. What I do know, with a certainty that has not faded in all the years since, is this. Humanity left without a word that morning, not because they had nothing left to say, but because they had already said everything that needed saying, in the months and years before, through every careful report, every patient explanation, every polite and courteous appearance at a table that never truly listened until it was far too late to matter. They departed in silence because silence, in the end, was the only language left that we had not yet learned to ignore. And whatever comes next between our peoples, however many delegations we send, however many careful apologies we craft in the years ahead, I do not believe we will ever again mistake their patience for permission, or their courtesy for forgiveness freely given. Some debts, once understood fully, cannot simply be erased by the passage of time or the careful wording of an official record. They can only be remembered, carried forward, and, if we are fortunate enough to be given the chance, slowly and honestly repaid. I do not know if that chance will ever fully come, but I know, now, exactly what we did to lose it in the first place, and I know that humanity, wherever they have gone, and whatever they continue to build in that quiet corner of the galaxy they no longer share freely with us, remembers every single detail of it far more clearly than we ever allowed ourselves to.